Captain Dongsu stared at his coffee cup and wondered why it was floating. Again. The ship's gravity systems worked perfectly fine everywhere else, but somehow his morning coffee always decided to ignore physics. He watched the dark liquid spin, in lazy circles inside the cup, completely unbothered by the fact that it should have fallen on his boots 10 minutes ago. "Bo-Ra, did you mess with the gravity settings again?" he called out to his navigator, who was hunched over her control panel making frustrated clicking sounds with her tongue. "Nope. That's all you, Captain," Bo-Ra replied without looking up. "Maybe the universe just likes your coffee better when it's weightless." The bridge of the exploration vessel, Perseverance, looked like organized chaos. Cables ran everywhere they shouldn't. Buttons had been rewired to do things they weren't designed for, and half the warning lights had been covered with colorful tape because nobody wanted to deal with whatever they were warning about. It had been their home for 2 years now, drifting around the outer edges of known space, officially mapping star systems for the Galactic Confederation. Unofficially, they were hiding. Tai-Ho emerged from the engine room covered in what looked like blue grease, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just convinced a machine to work through pure stubbornness. "Good news, Captain. The engines are running perfectly. Bad news, I have no idea why, and I'm pretty sure they're powered by hope and recycled air filters at this point." "As long as they keep running," Dongsu said, finally grabbing his floating coffee cup. The liquid immediately fell into his lap. "So, Young, any messages from command today?" Their communications officer looked up from her console with innocent eyes. "Oh, you know how it is, Captain. Space interference, solar flares, cosmic background radiation. Very hard to receive clear signals out here in the middle of nowhere." "Uh-huh. And how many messages have you accidentally lost this week?" "Only the boring ones asking where we are and when we're coming back to report." The Galactic Confederation didn't particularly like humans who asked too many questions or wandered too far from approved routes. Dongsu and his crew had developed a reputation for both. They were supposed to be good little explorers, finding nice, safe planets for colonization and filing proper reports in triplicate. Instead, they kept stumbling into strange phenomena, asking uncomfortable questions about ancient ruins, and generally being the kind of humans that made bureaucrats nervous, which was exactly why they preferred the Outer Rim, where bureaucrats feared to tread. "Captain," Bo-Ra called out, her voice suddenly different, more focused. "You need to see this." Dongsu drifted over to her station, dodging a floating wrench that Tai-Ho had apparently left in zero gravity earlier. The navigation display showed their current position in the Kepler 442 system, a supposedly empty patch of space that was perfect for hiding from official oversight. "What am I looking at?" "That's the problem. I'm not sure." Bo-Ra pointed at a blinking dot on the screen. "Sensors keep picking up a planet in this system. Class M, oxygen atmosphere, definitely habitable. But according to our star charts, there's nothing here." "Sensor malfunction?" "That's what I thought. But watch this." Bo-Ra pressed a few controls, and the display refreshed. The planet disappeared. She pressed them again. It reappeared. "It's like the planet is there, then not there, then there again." Tai-Ho peered over their shoulders, leaving blue fingerprints on the console. "Maybe it's shy?" "Planets don't get shy, Tai-Ho. Hey, after 2 years on this ship, I've seen weirder things. Remember that asteroid that kept apologizing every time we scanned it?" So Young joined them, abandoning her communications post. "The sensors are picking up electromagnetic signatures, too. Not natural ones. Artificial. Someone's down there." "Or something," Bo-Ra added helpfully. Dongsu felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull. The same feeling he'd gotten right before they discovered the ancient ruins on Proxima 7 that weren't supposed to exist. The same feeling that had preceded their encounter with the time loop nebula that Command insisted was just a navigation error. The feeling that meant they were about to find something that would make their lives significantly more complicated. "Set course for the planet," he said, "if it's there when we arrive. And if it's not, then we'll wait until it decides to show up again." The Perseverance changed course with its usual mixture of smooth precision and mechanical complaints. The ship had been designed for standard exploration missions, not for the kind of impossible situations that Dongsu's crew seemed to attract. But Taeho had modified the engines with creative engineering that bordered on the supernatural, and the ship had learned to expect the unexpected. As they approached the coordinates, the planet shimmered into existence like a mirage solidifying. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly. Blue oceans, green continents, white clouds that swirled in patterns that were almost musical. It looked exactly like the kind of world that the Confederation would want to claim, catalog, and turn into another administrative zone. But the energy signatures coming from the surface were all wrong. "Captain," So-Young said quietly, "I'm picking up communication signals. They're in human languages." "Which human languages?" "All of them, but mostly Korean." The bridge fell silent except for the usual humming of jury-rigged equipment and the distant sound of something rattling in the walls. Humans spoke Korean, but humans had never been to this system. According to every official record, humans had barely left their home solar system, and certainly hadn't established colonies in uncharted space. "Are you sure it's Korean?" Young nodded, looking pale. "I'm picking up what sounds like normal conversation. People talking about weather, work schedules, someone complaining that their neighbor's dog keeps digging up their garden." "Dogs?" Taeho asked. "They have dogs?" Apparently. Bo-Ra was staring at her instruments with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been politely asked to step outside. "Captain, I'm also detecting cities. Big ones. This isn't some lost colony ship or research outpost. There are millions of people down there. Millions of people who speak Korean and somehow manage to build a civilization on a planet that appears and disappears at random," Dongsu said slowly. "Pretty much, yeah." Dongsu looked around his bridge at his crew of misfits and rule breakers. They had spent 2 years running away from the Confederation's orderly, regulated, completely predictable universe. Now they had stumbled onto something that made absolutely no sense according to any law of physics, politics, or basic logic. "Well," he said finally, "I guess we should go introduce ourselves. What if they don't want visitors? Then we'll apologize and leave. But somehow, I don't think that's going to be a problem." As the Perseverance descended toward the impossible planet, Dongsu couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just making first contact with an unknown human settlement. They were about to discover something that would change everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. His coffee cup, still sitting on his chair, started floating again. The landing pad materialized around them as the Perseverance touched down. One moment they were descending toward empty grassland, the next moment they were sitting on a perfectly constructed platform made of some kind of smooth, dark stone that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. "Well, that's not creepy at all," Taeho muttered, watching the pad extend itself to exactly match their ship's dimensions. Dongsu stood at the viewport, looking out at what appeared to be a normal, human settlement. Buildings that could have been from any Earth city rose in the distance. connected by roads filled with what looked like perfectly ordinary people going about perfectly ordinary business. The only unusual thing was how unremarkable everything seemed. "Captain," So Young called from her station, "we're being hailed." "Put it through." The main screen flickered to life, showing a man who looked to be in his 40s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm expression that suggested he dealt with impossible visitors on a regular basis. He was standing in what appeared to be a control room filled with equipment that looked both familiar and completely wrong. "Welcome to Jindo," the man said in perfect Korean. "I'm Hyun Woo, the current coordinator for this settlement. We've been expecting you." Bora raised an eyebrow. "Expecting us? We didn't even know you existed until an hour ago." Hyun-woo smiled. "Time moves differently when you learn to walk between folds. We saw your ship 3 days ago. Subjective time. Please, come down when you're ready. We have much to discuss." The connection ended, leaving the bridge in silence. Fold walking? Minho, their physicist, emerged from the science section looking confused. "That's not a real thing. You can't just fold space-time like origami." "Tell that to the landing pad that didn't exist 5 minutes ago," Dong-Soo replied. An hour later, they were walking through the settlement that called itself Jindo. The people they passed looked completely human, wore normal clothes, and were doing normal things like carrying groceries and walking dogs. Children played in parks. Old men sat on benches arguing about sports. It was so aggressively ordinary that it made Dong-Soo's teeth itch. "This is impossible," Minho kept muttering. The energy requirements alone to make an entire planet phase in and out of dimensional space would require more power than our sun produces in a year. "Maybe they have really good batteries," Taeho suggested helpfully. Hyun-woo met them at what appeared to be a town hall, though the building's architecture seemed to shift slightly when nobody was looking directly at it. He was accompanied by a woman who introduced herself as Yoon-ji, their chief engineer. "Please sit," Hyun-woo said, gesturing to chairs that definitely hadn't been there when they entered the room. "I imagine you have questions." "Just a few thousand," Dong-Soo replied, "starting with how you got here and why our sensors can't seem to decide if your planet exists." "We've been here for about 300 years local time," Yoon-ji said, "though that translates to roughly 70 years in standard galactic time. Time gets complicated when you're moving between folds." So Young leaned forward. "What exactly is fold walking?" "Think of reality like fabric," Hyun-woo explained. "Most people see it as flat, solid, unchangeable, but fabric has folds, creases, spaces between threads. We learn to walk in those spaces." Minho shook his head. "That's not how physics works. Reality has laws, constants, rules that can't be broken." Yoon-ji laughed, a sound like wind chimes, in a gentle breeze. "Your confederation teaches that reality is fixed because it makes their job easier. But we learned something different. Reality is just very, very stubborn. If you're persistent enough and creative enough, you can convince it to bend." "Show them," Hyun-woo said quietly. Yoon-ji stood up and walked to what looked like a control panel made of crystallized light and impossible angles. She pressed her hands against it, and suddenly the room was filled with a low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls became transparent, showing them a view of space that made no sense. They could see their ship, sitting on the landing pad, but they could also see the planet from orbit, and somehow they were looking down at themselves in the room from above, while simultaneously looking up at the sky from ground level. We call them tremor drives, Yunji explained as the impossible view faded back to normal walls. They work by making reality itself shiver with uncertainty. When the universe isn't sure where something is supposed to be, we can convince it to be where we want it instead. Taeho's eyes were wide. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's also completely impossible, Minho added, though he sounded less certain than before. Impossible is just another word for nobody's figured it out yet, Yunji said. Your people are good at accepting limitations. We're good at ignoring them. So Young had been quiet, but now she spoke up. You said you've been here for 300 years, but humans only started leaving Earth recently. How did you get here? Hyunwoo and Yunji exchanged glances. We didn't come from Earth, Hyunwoo said finally. Not directly. We're connected to dozens of other settlements scattered across the galaxy. Communities that learn to live in the spaces between certainty and doubt. How many? Dongsu asked. Hundreds of settlements, maybe thousands. We don't keep exact records because numbers get complicated when you're dealing with multiple dimensions and non-linear time. The room fell silent except for the sound of Minho's world view quietly collapsing in the corner. You've been watching the galaxy, Dongsu said. It wasn't a question. For centuries, Hyunwoo confirmed. We've seen the Confederation grow, establish their perfect order, divide everything into neat categories. We've watched them eliminate chaos, uncertainty, and creative unpredictability. And you've been taking notes, So Young added. Yunji smiled. Detailed notes. We've learned a lot about how the three species think, what they fear, and what happens when their perfect systems encounter something they can't categorize or control. Like us showing up here, Bo-Ra said. Exactly like you showing up here. Dong-Su felt that familiar tingle again, the one that warned him his life was about to get much more complicated. Our presence here won't go unnoticed. Command will send investigation fleets when we don't report in on schedule. We know, Hyunwoo said calmly. We've been preparing for that day for a very long time. What happens when they get here? Yunji's smile widened. They'll find empty space. We'll have stepped sideways out of their dimension, but they'll know we were here. They'll know something exists that their sensors can't track, their weapons can't target, and their logic can't comprehend. And that scares them, Hyunwoo added. The three species have built their entire civilization on the idea that everything can be understood, controlled, and categorized. We represent something that challenges that fundamental belief. What do you want from us? Dongsu asked. Nothing, Hyunwoo said. You've already given us what we needed just by being here, by finding us, by proving that even their own people can stumble onto impossibilities. Outside, alarms began to sound in the distance, not emergency alarms, but the kind of organized warning signals that meant everyone knew exactly what to do. Confederation ships approaching, Yunji said, checking her impossible control panel. Right on schedule. 3 fleets, all 3 species represented. Time to disappear? Bo-Ra asked. Time to give the galaxy its first taste of uncertainty, Hyunwoo replied. This should be interesting. The Confederation fleets arrived with the kind of overwhelming force that was designed to end conversations before they started. Dongsu watched from Jindo's observation deck as 3 different types of warships materialized in the system, each representing thousands of years of military superiority. The Vorthak crystal ships looked like enormous geometric sculptures that happened to carry weapons capable of turning planets into glitter. Their surfaces reflected starlight in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and their hulls were made from crystallized mathematics that could calculate the exact amount of force needed to solve any problem. The luminary vessels were harder to see because they weren't quite there in the traditional sense. They existed as organized energy patterns held together by pure will and ancient technology. When they moved, they left trails of light that wrote equations in space-time, and their weapons could convince matter to simply stop existing. The Nexari bioships were the most disturbing because they were alive, massive organisms bred for war, with hulls that healed from damage and weapons that grew from their bodies like thorns. They moved through space with the fluid grace of predators, and their sensors could taste fear across vacuum. "Impressive," Yunji said calmly, watching the display screens that showed the approaching fleets. They brought everything except subtlety. Hyunwoo stood next to her, looking like a man watching an interesting weather pattern. Standard Confederation response to unknown threats. Overwhelming force followed by demands for surrender. "Are we going to surrender?" Taeho asked hopefully. "Where would be the fun in that?" The communication systems crackled to life with the voice of Grand Hierarch Zix Thul, the Vorthak commander. Even through the translation matrix, his words carried the weight of absolute authority that came from 3,000 years of unquestioned dominance. "Unknown human settlement. You exist in violation of galactic law and represent a threat to established order. Prepare for immediate evacuation and processing. Compliance is not optional." Hyunwoo picked up a communication device that looked like it had been grown rather than built. "This is Jindo settlement to Confederation fleets. We appreciate your concern, but we're quite comfortable where we are. Also, we're not sure what laws you're referring to, since we never agreed to follow them." The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded very large explosions. "You will comply," came the mechanical voice of Nexari Overmind Collective 7. "Resistance serves no logical function. You cannot escape our sensors. You cannot match our firepower. You cannot survive our combined assault." "Probably not," Hyunwoo agreed cheerfully. "But we weren't planning to try any of those things." Prime Luminant Ether Dawn's voice joined the conversation, sounding like crystallized starlight given the ability to be annoyed. "Explain your intentions, human anomaly." "We're going to show you something new," Yunji said, taking over the communication. "Something your perfect order has forgotten how to experience. We're going to show you what happens when reality decides to dance." The attack began with the Vorthak ships firing their crystalline destruction beams. The weapons were mathematical, perfection made manifest, capable of calculating the exact molecular structure of any target and then convincing those molecules to arrange themselves differently, usually into component atoms scattered across several light years. The beams hit Jindo's position and passed right through empty space. The planet had simply stepped sideways out of their dimension, leaving behind only empty coordinates and very confused sensors. "Target has vanished," reported a Vorthak tactical officer, his voice carrying the kind of bewilderment that came from having mathematics fail to work properly. "Impossible," Collective 7 stated. "Matter cannot simply cease to exist without energy conversion." But even as they spoke, Jindo flickered back into existence, now positioned exactly where it had been before, as if nothing had happened. "Sorry about that." Hyunwoo's voice came over the communication channel. "We had to step out for a moment." "Where were we?" "Oh yes, you were trying to destroy us." The Luminari ships responded by firing weapons that attacked the past. Their quantum disruptors reached back through time to prevent Jindo from ever existing in the first place. It was the kind of attack that made philosophers weep and caused headaches in the Department of Temporal Paradox Prevention. The weapons found their target in the timeline and erased it completely. For exactly 3 seconds, Jindo had never existed. Then, it came back along with a note of polite confusion in Yunji's voice. That was interesting. You tried to edit us out of history. Unfortunately, we exist in several histories simultaneously, so you'd need to find all of them. The Nexari bioships launched their living weapons, projectiles that could adapt to any defense, evolve past any shield, and survive in any environment. The missiles were intelligent enough to hold grudges and patient enough to wait centuries for revenge. They struck Jindo's shields and promptly became very confused. The planet's defenses weren't blocking the attacks or destroying them. Instead, they were convincing the missiles that they had already succeeded, so there was no need to explode. The living weapons drifted away peacefully, satisfied with their imaginary victory. This is not possible, Grand Hierarch Zixthul declared, his mathematical certainty beginning to show cracks. No defense system can operate outside the laws of physics. You're absolutely right, Hyunwoo replied. Our defenses don't operate outside the laws of physics. They operate in the spaces between the laws, where things get a bit more flexible. What happened next would be discussed in military academies for the next 1,000 years, assuming there were still military academies after everything that followed. Ships began appearing around the Confederation fleets. Not emerging from hyperspace or uncloaking or materializing from some hidden dimension, they were simply there, as if they had been waiting patiently for someone to notice them. These ships looked human but wrong. Their hulls curved in directions that geometry insisted were impossible. Their engines left trails of light that spelled out poetry in languages that hadn't been invented yet. When they moved, they didn't travel through space so much as convince space to rearrange itself around them. Ji-won, the Foldwalker fleet commander, opened a communication channel to all ships simultaneously. Her voice carried the kind of calm, confidence that came from having reality as a personal friend. Confederation fleets, welcome to our little corner of the impossible. We've been looking forward to meeting you properly. Identify yourselves, Collective 7 demanded. We're the people. You didn't know existed, Ji-won replied. The humans who learned to walk between certainty and doubt, the ones who found out that reality has a sense of humor. The battle that followed wasn't really a battle in any traditional sense. The Foldwalker ships didn't attack the Confederation fleets directly. Instead, they did things that made the enemy vessels question their own existence. A Vorthak crystal ship found itself temporarily convinced that it was actually a very large flower vase and spent 10 minutes trying to hold water before its crew managed to restore its proper identity. A luminary energy vessel experienced what could only be described as an existential crisis when Foldwalker weapons made it aware of its own mortality. It took 3 hours of emergency meditation for the ship's consciousness to accept that even energy beings could have bad days. A Nexari bioship grew confused about which direction was up and began swimming through space as if it were underwater, complete with dolphin-like clicking sounds that translated roughly as, "Where did the ocean go?" But the most disturbing part wasn't the impossible attacks. It was that none of the Confederation ships were actually being damaged. They were just being forced to experience things that their perfect, orderly existence had never prepared them for: confusion, uncertainty, the possibility that there might be more than one right answer to the same question. As the engagement continued, reports began flooding back to the three species' home worlds. Ships that had never failed were failing to understand what was happening to them. Weapons that had never missed were missing targets that were standing right in front of them. Sensors that had never been fooled were seeing things that couldn't exist. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Confederation's absolute certainty began to develop cracks, and in those cracks, something new began to grow. The chaos spread faster than anyone expected. What had started as a simple military engagement in one star system became something that infected the entire galaxy's understanding of how things were supposed to work. Subin stood on the observation deck of her Foldwalker ship, watching a Vorthak crystal city through dimensions that didn't have names. She wasn't planning to attack the city or destroy anything. Violence was messy and inefficient. Instead, she was going to do something much more disturbing. She was going to make them question everything. Her ship materialized in the exact center of the Crystal City's main plaza, existing peacefully among the geometric perfection of Vorthak architecture. The vessel looked like it had been carved from solidified music, with curves that sang when the light hit them and surfaces that reflected thoughts instead of images. The Vorthak citizens stopped their orderly daily routines and stared. In 3,000 years of perfect civilization, nothing had ever appeared in their plaza without proper authorization, environmental impact studies, and 17 different permits. Subin activated her ship's external communication system and began broadcasting, the most dangerous thing she could think of. A simple message that would shake the foundation of everything the Vorthak believed about reality. "Hello," she said in perfect Vorthak crystalline speak. "We exist, and we're not supposed to. Isn't that interesting?" For exactly 17 minutes, her ship sat there peacefully while Vorthak citizens walked around it, touched it, scanned it with every instrument they had, and tried to understand how something could be there when all their calculations said it was impossible. Then Subin's ship vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense that reality was more flexible than anyone had previously believed. The effect rippled outward from that plaza like cracks spreading through perfect crystal. Vorthak scientists began questioning their mathematical constants. Engineers started wondering if there might be more than one way to build things. Artists began experimenting with shapes that changed depending on who was looking at them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Wu Jin was conducting his own form of warfare. The Foldwalker scientist had positioned himself at the center of the Galactic Communication Network and begun broadcasting what he called chaos mathematics to anyone willing to listen. His equations were beautiful and terrible. They described how consciousness could influence quantum probability, how belief could alter physical constants, and how the act of observation didn't just reveal reality, but actively participated in creating it. The mathematics were perfect. That was the problem. They made complete sense, even as they described things that were supposed to be impossible. Confederation scientists who tried to disprove Wu Jin's theories found themselves in increasingly uncomfortable situations. Their research laboratories began behaving strangely as local space-time started responding to the researchers' mental states. Equipment that had worked perfectly for centuries suddenly began producing results that changed based on what the operators expected to find. On a luminary research station, Dr. Bright Nova spent 3 days trying to prove that consciousness couldn't affect quantum mechanics. By the end of the 3rd day, her laboratory equipment had become so entangled with her thoughts that it started giving her advice about her personal relationships. A Nexari collective working on temporal mechanics found that their time dilation experiments began producing different results depending on which part of the hive mind was observing them. When the artistic sub-collective watched, time moved like poetry. When the engineering sub-collective observed, time behaved like clockwork. When they tried to observe together, time got confused and started running backward for 17 minutes. The three species' perfect unity began developing stress fractures. Some Vorthak began growing crystals that changed color based on emotion, creating gardens that bloomed in impossible hues. Groups of luminari discovered the joy of disagreeing with themselves, splitting into multiple perspectives just to experience what an argument felt like from both sides. Most disturbing of all, individual Nexari drones began forming personal opinions. The hive mind, which had operated in perfect harmony for millennia, suddenly found itself dealing with members who insisted on having different ideas about art, music, and the proper way to organize filing systems. The Confederation's leadership called emergency sessions to address what they termed the reality instability crisis. Grand Hierarch Zixthul's mathematical certainty showed visible cracks as he tried to explain to his council how an enemy could exist in 17 places simultaneously while technically not existing anywhere at all. Prime Luminant Ether Dawn experienced something unprecedented for a being of pure energy. She began to doubt herself. The emotion was so foreign that she spent 6 hours in meditation trying to identify what she was feeling, only to realize that the uncertainty itself was becoming part of her identity. Collective 7 had perhaps the most difficult time adapting. A hive mind built on absolute consensus suddenly found itself containing members who wanted to paint landscapes, write poetry, and spend entire afternoons wondering what clouds tasted like. But the most profound shake came when Young Su, a fold-walker, archaeologist, made an announcement that reached every corner of the galaxy. Broadcasting from hidden spaces between dimensions, he revealed evidence that would rewrite galactic history. Humans hadn't just appeared in the galaxy recently, they had always been there. "We've been here longer than your civilizations have existed," Young-Su explained to audiences across thousands of worlds. "We've lived in the spaces between your certainties, in the gaps where your perfect order forgot to look. The Confederation's 3,000-year reign isn't the galaxy's natural state. It's an aberration. A brief moment when the universe temporarily forgot how to dance." He showed images of ancient human settlements hidden in dimensional folds, archaeological, evidence of human presence dating back tens of thousands of years, and star maps that revealed a network of fold-walker communities that had existed parallel to galactic civilization without ever touching it. "You thought you had divided the galaxy into perfect sectors," Young-Su continued, "but you only mapped the surfaces. We've been living in the depths, in the spaces where probability meets possibility, where certainty learns to bend." The revelation hit the three species like a wave of existential vertigo. Everything they believed about galactic history, about their own development, about the natural order of things, suddenly became questionable. Captain Dong-Su found himself at the center of a transformation he had never intended to cause. His crew's simple exploration mission had become the catalyst for the galaxy's greatest philosophical revolution since the first conscious thought had looked up at stars and wondered what they were. "So what do we do now?" Bo-Ra asked during one of their daily meetings on Jindo. They had been guests of the Foldwalkers for weeks now, watching as reports came in of reality itself becoming more flexible across the galaxy. "We keep exploring," Dong-Su said, "but now we're exploring a galaxy that's learning to question everything it thought it knew about itself." Taeho looked up from the Foldwalker technology he had been studying. Can I just say that I really like a universe where the impossible happens on a regular basis? It makes my job as an engineer so much more interesting. The universe was always like this, Hyunwoo said, joining their conversation. The Confederation just spent 3,000 years trying to make everyone forget. We're not changing reality. We're reminding it how to be itself again. So Young monitored communication channels that brought news from across the galaxy. Reports of Vorthak cities growing in curves instead of straight lines. Luminary collectives learning to sing in harmony, with their own disagreements. Nexari individuals discovering the joy of personal hobbies. It's spreading faster than we expected, she reported. The three species are adapting to uncertainty much quicker than anyone predicted. Life is adaptable, Yunji observed. Even perfect order gets tired of being perfect eventually. Sometimes all it needs is permission to try something different. Outside Jindo's windows, the galaxy continued its ancient dance, but now the steps were improvised rather than choreographed. And for the first time in 3,000 years, nobody knew what song would play next. 6 months after the first shake, the galaxy looked like a completely different place. Inho stood in what used to be the Confederation's central command station, now transformed into something that defied every architectural principle the three species had ever agreed upon. The walls curved in impossible directions, creating spaces that were somehow larger on the inside than the outside. Vorthak crystal formations grew alongside luminary light sculptures, while Nexari biogardens provided living furniture that adjusted itself to whoever sat down. The whole structure pulsed with a gentle rhythm that sounded suspiciously like jazz music played by quantum particles. I never thought I'd miss the boring gray hallways, Inho said to his assistant, a former Confederation bureaucrat named Kextal, who had developed an alarming fondness for human poetry. But think of how much more interesting everything is now, Kextal replied, his crystalline voice taking on the cadence of someone who had been reading too much modern literature. The hallways now have feelings. Yesterday, Corridor 7 was melancholy, so it grew itself some windows to let in more starlight. Inho had been appointed as the galaxy's first ambassador of uncertainty, a job title that would have been meaningless 6 months ago and was still mostly meaningless now. His official duties included encouraging creative unpredictability while maintaining basic safety standards and making sure reality doesn't get too carried away with itself. It was the strangest job in galactic history, and he loved every impossible minute of it. The transformation hadn't been violent. That was the part that surprised everyone, including the Fold Walkers who had started it all. Instead of war and conquest, the galaxy had simply relaxed. Like a person who had been holding their breath for 3,000 years and finally remembered how to exhale. The Confederation's rigid borders had dissolved into flowing zones where different species experimented with new ways of living together. Trade routes now took scenic detours through alternate dimensions, making commerce an adventure instead of a chore. The standard galactic calendar had been replaced with something called flexible time, which meant meetings started when everyone felt ready and lasted as long as they needed to. Hyejin's probability mechanics had become the foundation for a new kind of infrastructure. Space stations that reconfigured themselves based on their inhabitants' needs. Buildings that grew extra rooms when families expanded and shrank when people moved away. Transportation networks that somehow always managed to get people where they needed to go, even when they weren't entirely sure where that was. The engineering principles still make no sense, Tejo reported during one of their regular check-ins. He was working with a mixed team of Vorthak geometrists, luminary pattern weavers, and Nexari bioarchitects to design a new type of city that could exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Does it work? Inho asked. Perfectly. That's what makes it so frustrating. Then don't worry about understanding it. Sometimes the universe likes to keep a few secrets. Captain Dong-Su had returned to exploration, but the nature of exploration itself had changed. His crew now included Bright Crystal, a Vorthak geologist who specialized in rocks that existed only on Tuesdays, Wave Song, a luminary navigator who could plot courses through theoretical space, and a Nexari engineering collective that had learned to argue with itself so creatively that their disagreements produced innovative solutions to impossible problems. The Perseverance had been upgraded with fold-walker technology, though upgraded wasn't quite the right word. The ship had been convinced to become more than it was, expanding its capabilities through pure enthusiasm rather than additional hardware. "Captain," Bora called from her navigation station, "we're receiving a signal from the Andromeda Galaxy. They want to know if we're interested in a cultural exchange program. How are they communicating across intergalactic distances? Apparently they heard about our reality flexibility experiments and figured out how to send messages through the spaces between probability waves." Dong-Su smiled. "Set course for Andromeda. It's about time we met the neighbors." The Fold-Walker communities had emerged from their hidden spaces to become the galaxy's new cultural centers, not through conquest or politics, but because they had simply become the most interesting places to visit. Their cities existed in multiple dimensions, offering experiences that ranged from walking through solid light to having philosophical conversations with sentient architecture. Jindo had become a university where students could take courses in applied impossibility, creative physics, and introduction to reality maintenance. The graduation ceremony involved convincing a small asteroid to develop consciousness and then helping it choose a career path. But perhaps the most significant change was in the galaxy's approach to leadership. The old Confederation hierarchy had been replaced with something called the Uncertainty Council, where decisions were made through a process that involved careful consideration, creative disagreement, and occasional rock-paper-scissors tournaments. Sora, the former Grand Hierarch of the Confederation, found herself surprisingly happy in her new role as a chaos theory consultant. She helped newly liberated civilizations learn to embrace productive uncertainty, teaching them the difference between destructive chaos and creative unpredictability. "We spent 3,000 years trying to make the galaxy hold still," she admitted, to Dong-Su during a celebration that was simultaneously a funeral for the old order and a birthday party for cosmic possibility. "We never realized that the most beautiful thing about existence is that it never stops dancing." The party was being held on a space station that had grown itself for the occasion, creating ballrooms in 17 dimensions and dance floors that responded to the music by changing gravity, color, and occasionally species. Vorthak crystals chimed in harmony with luminary light songs, while Nexari biomusicians played instruments that grew new strings based on the audience's emotional state. Young-Su, the archaeologist who had revealed humanity's hidden history, was telling stories to a mixed audience of children from all species. His tales were about the early days of fold walking, when humans first learned to step sideways out of linear time and discovered that reality had been waiting for them to arrive. "The secret," he explained to his wide-eyed listeners, "is that the universe likes surprises. It gets bored when everything is too predictable. So sometimes it hides little gifts in the spaces between certainty and doubt, waiting for someone curious enough to find them." Wu Jin had established the galaxy's first department of impossible mathematics. where researchers studied equations that changed their answers based on who was solving them and theorems that proved themselves by existing. His latest paper, On the Probability of Improbable Things Becoming Probable, had become required reading in philosophy classes across 17 star systems. The communication networks had evolved too. Instead of just transmitting words and images, they sometimes carried emotions, dreams, and the occasional abstract concept that didn't have a name yet. Conversations between different species had become more like collaborative art projects, with meaning emerging from the spaces between languages. But the best part, Inho thought as he watched the celebration continue around him, was that nobody knew what would happen next. For 3,000 years, the galaxy had been predictable, ordered, safe, and ultimately boring. Now it was uncertain, creative, occasionally, chaotic, and absolutely alive with possibility. The Foldwalkers had succeeded in their goal. They had made the galaxy shake and tremble, not with fear, but with the excitement of infinite potential. Reality had remembered how to dance, and everyone was invited to learn the steps. Outside the space station's windows, stars twinkled in patterns that spelled out poetry in languages that were being invented by the light itself. Nebulae swirled in colors that had names in 17 different species' vocabularies. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, new wonders were waiting to be discovered by anyone brave enough to step sideways out of certainty and into the beautiful unknown. The galaxy was dancing, and the music would never stop.